On January 17, 2026, the President of the United States threatened to impose tariffs on 8 of America's closest allies unless they agreed to sell him an island that isn't for sale. The President of the United States suggested that America might use military force to take Greenland, not buy it, not negotiate for it, take it. The world assumed it was a joke, another provocative headline designed to dominate a news cycle. Then the tariffs started. Within weeks, the United States imposed sweeping trade penalties on European goods, cars, steel, aluminum, wine, cheese, anything that could hurt. Denmark, the country that actually owns Greenland, watched its economy take direct hits. The European Union scrambled to respond. Stock markets from Frankfurt to New York began showing signs of stress, and suddenly, the joke didn't seem like a joke anymore. This is the story of why the most powerful nation on Earth decided that a frozen island with 56,000 people was worth threatening its oldest allies, why markets started pricing in chaos, and what it reveals about a new era of American foreign policy that nobody was quite prepared for. It's not really about Greenland, it never was. Let's start with what Greenland actually is. It's the world's largest island, roughly 836,000 square miles of territory. That's bigger than Alaska, Texas, California, and Montana combined. But here's the thing, about 80% of it is covered by an ice sheet, permanent, frozen, uninhabitable by any practical definition. The population is 56,000 people. For context, that's smaller than a mid-sized suburb, more polar bears than traffic lights. The largest town has about 19,000 residents. Greenland has been a territory of Denmark since 1721, over 3 centuries of connection. In 2009, it gained expanded self-rule, controlling most domestic affairs while Denmark handles defense and foreign policy. The economy runs primarily on fishing and subsidies. Denmark sends roughly $500 million annually to keep Greenland functioning. That's about $9,000 per resident per year, just in direct transfers from Copenhagen. On paper, this seems like the last place anyone would fight over, but paper doesn't account for what's underneath the ice. Here's where the math starts getting uncomfortable. Greenland sits on what geologists believe is one of the largest untapped deposits of rare earth elements on the planet. Neodymium, dysprosium, terbium, names most people can't pronounce, but that power everything from smartphones to electric vehicles to fighter jets. Currently, China controls roughly 60% of global rare earth mining and nearly 90% of processing capacity. If you want to build advanced technology without Chinese involvement, you have a problem. Greenland could solve that problem. Beneath the ice and rock lie estimated deposits worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Some projections suggest the Kvanefjeld deposit alone contains enough rare earths to supply global demand for decades. Then there's oil. The US Geological Survey estimated that the waters around Greenland contain roughly 50 billion barrels of oil and gas. That's more than Libya's entire proven reserves. And we haven't mentioned uranium. Greenland has significant deposits, enough to matter in a world increasingly returning to nuclear power. But resources alone don't explain why this escalated so quickly. For that, you need to look at a map. Greenland occupies some of the most strategically valuable real estate on Earth. It sits directly between North America and Europe. More importantly, it sits directly between North America and Russia. During the Cold War, the United States understood this perfectly. In 1951, America signed a defense treaty with Denmark that gave US forces access to Greenland. The Thule Air Base, built in the island's far north, became one of the most important early warning stations against Soviet nuclear attack. Today, Thule hosts the 21st Space Wing's radar systems. It tracks everything that moves in the Arctic, every satellite, every missile, every object that enters polar airspace. If you control Greenland, you control the Arctic, and the Arctic is no longer the frozen wasteland it used to be. Climate change is opening new shipping routes. The Northern Sea route along Russia's coast is already operational for parts of the year. The Northwest Passage through Canada is becoming increasingly navigable. These routes could cut shipping times between Asia and Europe by weeks. They could reshape global trade patterns that have remained stable for generations. Whoever controls the Arctic controls the future of global logistics. Russia knows this. They've been building military bases across their Arctic territory for years. China, which calls itself a near-Arctic state, despite being nowhere near the Arctic, has been investing heavily in polar infrastructure. The United States looked at this map and saw a problem. Greenland was the solution. America has tried to buy Greenland before. In 1867, the State Department explored purchasing it. The idea went nowhere. In 1946, the Truman administration offered Denmark $100 million in gold. Denmark politely declined. In 2019, the previous Trump administration floated the idea publicly. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen called it absurd. The conversation ended badly, with a cancelled state visit and diplomatic tension. But 2025 was different. This time, the suggestion came with threats. In early January, President Trump stated publicly that he wouldn't rule out military force to acquire Greenland. He called American control of the island an absolute necessity for national security. The Danish government responded with disbelief. Prime Minister Frederiksen stated that Greenland was not for sale and that the threat of force against a NATO ally was unthinkable. The European Union rallied behind Denmark. French President Macron spoke of strengthening European defense capabilities. German officials expressed alarm at the breakdown of transatlantic norms. For about a week, it seemed like diplomatic theater, strong words that would fade into background noise. Then came February 1st. The tariffs hit without warning, a 25% levy on all goods from the European Union, cars, machinery, chemicals, food products, everything. The stated justification was trade imbalances. The EU sells more to America than it buys. The tariffs would correct this, according to the administration, but the timing was impossible to ignore. These weren't carefully negotiated trade measures. They weren't the result of months of diplomatic back and forth. They arrived like a hammer, weeks after the Greenland threats, aimed squarely at America's closest allies. The EU announced retaliatory tariffs within days. American bourbon, motorcycles, agricultural products. The tit-for-tat had begun. Markets noticed immediately. The S&P 500 dropped 2% on the announcement day. European indices fell harder. The DAX in Germany, heavily weighted toward export-dependent manufacturers, entered correction territory. But the real damage was more subtle. Here's how markets actually process political chaos. It's not about any single event. It's about predictability. For 70 years, the transatlantic relationship operated on certain assumptions. America would defend Europe. Europe would align with American interests. Trade disputes would happen, but within established frameworks. The WTO, bilateral negotiations, lengthy processes designed to prevent exactly this kind of sudden escalation. The Greenland episode broke those assumptions. If the United States could threaten military action against a NATO ally and then impose punishing tariffs when rebuffed, what else was possible? What other assumptions were no longer valid? Bond markets started pricing in geopolitical risk premiums they hadn't calculated in decades. The spread between US Treasuries and European bonds widened. Currency markets saw increased volatility, with the euro swinging unpredictably against the dollar. Corporate planners at multinational companies began asking uncomfortable questions. Should we reduce European exposure? Should we relocate supply chains? Should we assume that trade agreements will be honored? This uncertainty is more damaging than any specific tariff. A company can adjust to a 25% price increase. It cannot adjust to not knowing what the rules will be next month. Let's be clear about what the administration's strategy appeared to be. Greenland was a demand. The tariffs were leverage. The logic was transactional. Denmark receives American military protection through NATO. Without American commitment, Denmark would face Russia across an increasingly contested Arctic with minimal defensive capability. The implied message was straightforward. You need us more than we need you. Negotiate accordingly. This approach had worked before, at least in some contexts. During the first Trump administration, tariff threats had extracted concessions from trading partners. South Korea renegotiated its trade deal. Canada and Mexico accepted modifications to NAFTA. But Europe was different. The European Union represents 450 million people, the second largest economy on Earth. a combined GDP roughly equal to China's and substantially larger than Japan's. European leaders couldn't accept the premise that security guarantees were conditional on territorial concessions. If they did, what would stop similar demands in the future? What would stop any large power from bullying smaller allies into submission? The EU chose to fight. Retaliatory tariffs expanded. Discussions began about reducing dependence on American technology companies. Defense cooperation agreements between European nations accelerated, and Greenland itself started making noise. Here's the part that rarely gets attention. Greenlanders have opinions about their own future. The island's self-rule government watched this confrontation with a mixture of alarm and, unexpectedly, opportunity. For years, Greenlandic politicians had debated full independence from Denmark. The challenge was always economic. How could an island of 56,000 people survive without Danish subsidies? Suddenly, multiple suitors were interested. If America wanted Greenland badly enough to threaten its allies, what might America offer Greenland directly? Investment, infrastructure, a path to prosperity that didn't require Danish permission? Greenlandic Premier Mutta Egede walked a careful line. He rejected the idea of American military acquisition while leaving doors open for expanded cooperation. He spoke of Greenland's right to determine its own future. The dynamic shifted from a bilateral dispute between Washington and Copenhagen to something more complex, a three-way negotiation where the smallest party suddenly had leverage it never possessed before. American officials began visiting Nuuk, the Greenlandic capital. Investment proposals materialized: mining rights, port development, telecommunications, infrastructure. If Denmark wouldn't sell Greenland, perhaps Greenland could be persuaded to leave on its own. By late February, the market turbulence had taken on a life of its own. The tariff war between America and Europe showed no signs of resolution. Each round of retaliation prompted counter-retaliation. Each escalation made compromise more politically difficult. The Federal Reserve watched inflation expectations climb. Tariffs function as a tax on imports. Those costs pass through to consumers. The price of European cars, machinery, and goods began rising in American markets. At the same time, European demand for American products was falling. Retaliatory tariffs made American exports less competitive. Farmers saw markets they'd cultivated for decades suddenly closed. This was the uncomfortable math that policymakers faced. Tariffs might help certain industries, steel producers, aluminum smelters, but they hurt other industries more. Manufacturers who rely on imported components, retailers who sell imported goods, agriculture that depends on export markets. The net effect was negative, not catastrophically so, but measurably, and the uncertainty was magnifying everything. Here's what made this moment different from previous trade disputes. The stated goal was territorial acquisition. Previous tariff conflicts had economic objectives: reduce trade deficits, protect domestic industries, force market access, objectives that could be negotiated, measured, and eventually resolved. Greenland couldn't be divided into percentages. You couldn't split the difference on territorial sovereignty. Either Denmark controlled Greenland or it didn't. Either America respected Allied borders or it didn't. This made compromise nearly impossible. Any Danish concession on Greenland's status would be political suicide in Copenhagen. Any American retreat would look like weakness after such public demands. Both sides had backed themselves into corners. Markets understood this, which is why the volatility persisted. This wasn't a negotiation that would resolve through normal diplomatic channels. The fundamental demands were incompatible. Something had to give. Let's zoom out to what this episode revealed about the current moment. America's relationship with its allies is being renegotiated. For decades, the transatlantic partnership operated on shared values: democracy, free markets, rule of law. These weren't just words. They were operating principles that governed how disputes were handled. The Greenland episode suggested a different framework: transactional, power-based. What can you do for me, and what happens if you refuse? European leaders drew conclusions. Defense spending across NATO increased faster than at any point since the Cold War. France and Germany accelerated plans for independent European military capabilities. The previously theoretical concept of strategic autonomy suddenly had urgency. The irony was significant. By pressuring Europe, America was accelerating exactly the outcome it presumably wanted to prevent: a more independent Europe, less automatically aligned with American interests, more willing to chart its own course. The opposite of a stronger alliance. Meanwhile, other nations watched carefully. China saw opportunity in Western division. Russian strategists noted that NATO's unity was less automatic than assumed. Middle powers around the world recalculated their own relationships with Washington. If America would bully Denmark, a loyal ally for 3 centuries, what security did anyone have? The premium on hedging increased. Countries that had relied primarily on American security guarantees began diversifying. More engagement with China, more independent military investment, less assumption that America would always be there. This shift was subtle but measurable. Trade agreements that bypassed American participation, currency arrangements that reduced dollar dependence, defense cooperation that didn't include Washington. The architecture of American global leadership, built painstakingly since 1945, was showing stress fractures, not collapsing, not yet, but bending in ways that might not bend back. By spring, an uneasy equilibrium had emerged. The tariffs remained in place. Neither side had blinked. Greenland remained Danish territory, though American investment and attention had increased dramatically. Markets had adjusted to the new normal. Volatility elevated, but no longer spiking. Supply chains shifting incrementally. Relationships between allies cooler, but not frozen. The question that remained was whether this was temporary turbulence or permanent transformation. Would a future administration restore traditional alliances? Would Europe's move toward independence continue regardless of American policy changes? Would Greenland eventually choose its own path, independent of both Washington and Copenhagen? None of these questions had clear answers. Here's what the Greenland episode actually demonstrated. Power is more fluid than maps suggest. A frozen island that most Americans couldn't locate on a map became the focal point of a crisis that shook global markets and strained alliances that had endured for generations, not because of what Greenland is today, but because of what it might become tomorrow. Rare earth elements that power the technology race, Arctic shipping routes that could reshape global trade, military positions that matter in a world where great power competition is returning. The future was sitting under the ice, and everyone was scrambling to claim it. America chose confrontation. Europe chose resistance. Greenland chose to keep its options open. Markets did what markets do. They priced in uncertainty and waited to see who would blink first. The uncomfortable truth is that this story has no clean ending. Greenland remains Danish. The tariffs remain in place. European relations with America remain strained. Markets remain nervous about what comes next. The assumptions that governed international relations for decades have been challenged but not replaced. We're in a transitional moment where the old rules don't quite apply, but new rules haven't yet been established. What happens next depends on choices that haven't been made yet. Will America continue pursuing territorial ambitions through economic coercion? Will Europe develop genuine strategic independence, or eventually accommodate American demands? Will Greenland remain a territory or become something else entirely? These questions will shape the next decade of geopolitics, and they all started with a frozen island that most people had never thought about. The world is paying attention now. The question is whether anyone learned anything from what happened, or whether we're just waiting for the next crisis to reveal how fragile everything has become.